Have you ever thought about a moment where, like, a really big idea faces its first massive test,
Yeah.
where its whole future just hangs in the balance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was Bitcoin, wasn't it? Around 2015 to 2017, during what everyone now calls the scaling wars.
Mm, a really critical time. It was full of just intense debate, real questions about whether Bitcoin could actually be that peer-to-peer electronic cash Satoshi talked about.
Right. And the whole thing, amazingly, kind of boiled down to this one technical detail, didn't it? The one may be block size limit.
It sounds small, one may be. But yeah, that was the core of it. It was put there initially for a good reason, back in the early days.
Security, right, to stop spam attacks.
Exactly, protect the young network. But as Bitcoin got more popular, that same limit started causing major headaches.
Huge headaches, because one maybe meant, what, only like 3 to 7 transactions per second? Something like that?
Yeah, somewhere in that ballpark. Tiny, really.
Which, if you want to be global digital cash, well, that's a serious bottleneck. People were seeing transactions take ages, and worse, the fees started climbing.
Right. And that really hit the usability factor. If it costs too much or takes too long, you're not going to use it for coffee, are you?
No way.
But you have to remember that initial trade-off. It was deliberate, security first. But growth faced the issue, and it became this massive point of contention.
So that's what we're diving into today, right? This whole conflict. We'll look at the tech problems, the different ideas people had, BIP 91, hard forks, all that stuff.
Yeah, and the governance side, too. How do you make decisions in something like Bitcoin? And, of course, the lasting impact it all had.
Okay, let's get into it. Because it wasn't just technical fixes people were arguing about. It was deeper, wasn't it? Like fundamental disagreements about what Bitcoin is for.
Oh, completely. You basically saw two main camps emerge. People called them the big blockers and the small blockers. Very different philosophies.
So the big blockers, they wanted, well, bigger blocks.
Pretty much. They believed Bitcoin needed to scale right there on the main blockchain, increase the block size, fit more transactions in. Their vision was Bitcoin as, practical digital cash for everyday stuff.
And the high fees and slow times were proof the 1 MB limit was strangling that vision.
That was exactly their argument. It was holding Bitcoin back from its potential as money.
Okay, and the other side, the small blockers.
Their main worry was decentralization and security. They felt that much bigger blocks would make it really expensive and difficult for ordinary people to run a full node, to validate the blockchain themselves.
Which could lead to centralization, fewer people controlling the network.
That was the fear. So their focus was more on making the existing chain work better, optimizing data, and looking at ways to handle transactions off the main chain, layer 2 solutions, basically.
So totally different priorities there. One focused on on-chain capacity, the other on decentralization and off-chain scaling.
Precisely. And just to hammer home the scale of the problem, you mentioned 3.7 transactions per second for Bitcoin. Compare that to, say, Visa.
Oh yeah, Visa's capacity is huge, isn't it?
Massive. They can handle something like, upwards of 24,000 transactions per second. It just shows the massive gap Bitcoin needed to bridge somehow.
Okay, so huge problem, different philosophies. What were the actual solutions being put on the table?
Well, they fell into those two main buckets we just mentioned. First, you had on-chain scaling.
The big blocker approach.
Exactly. Just increase the block size limit directly. Proposals like Bitcoin XT popped up, then Bitcoin Unlimited, and eventually this led to Bitcoin Cash. The idea was simple. Bigger blocks mean more transactions, faster, cheaper, all on the main chain.
Okay, makes sense. And the second category?
That was off-chain scaling, or maybe optimizing the existing chain first. This is more the small blocker preference.
Right. Making things more efficient, moving stuff off the main layer.
Yes, and this is where segregated witness SegWit comes in. And the Lightning Network concept started gaining traction too. The focus here was really preserving that decentralization and security while still finding ways to handle way more transactions, just not all directly in every single block.
SegWit, that's a name that comes up constantly from this era. Let's unpack that. It was a soft fork, right?
Correct. A soft fork, think of it like a software upgrade that's mostly backward compatible. Older software can still kind of understand what's going on, even if it doesn't use the new features.
Okay, and what did SegWit actually do?
The key idea was to separate the signature data, the witness data, from the main transaction data within a block.
Okay, separating the signatures, how does that help scale? Seems a bit indirect.
Well, it had a few really big benefits, actually. First, that witness data takes up a fair bit of space. By moving it, you freed up room within that original 1 MB block structure.
So you could fit more transactions into the same 1 MB block, effectively.
Exactly. The technical block size limit stayed 1 MB, but the effective capacity went up. People debated exactly how much, maybe like 1.7 MB, maybe 2 MB. Some even said up to 4 MB equivalent space for transactions. A definite boost.
Okay, that's a clever way to increase capacity. What else?
Second, and this was huge, separating the witness fixed a long-standing bug called transaction malleability.
Transaction malleability. Sounds complex. Why was fixing that so important?
Basically, malleability meant someone could slightly change the unique ID of a Bitcoin transaction before it got confirmed in a block. The actual transaction details who sent what to whom wouldn't change, but the ID could.
Okay, and why is that bad?
It created big problems if you wanted to build things on top of Bitcoin, especially layer 2 networks, like the Lightning Network. Lightning relies on transactions being predictable and having fixed IDs to work properly. Fixing malleability was absolutely crucial for layer 2 to even be possible.
Got it. So SegWit wasn't just about fitting more transactions in, it was enabling future tech like Lightning.
Yes, that was a massive part of it. And there was a third benefit, too. It introduced something called script versioning, which basically made it easier to roll out future upgrades to Bitcoin's rules in a cleaner way.
Okay, so SegWit sounds pretty good on paper. More capacity, fixes a key bug, helps future upgrades. So why was actually getting it activated such a massive fight?
Well, that gets right to the heart of the governance battle. The original plan for activating SegWit was laid out in BIP9. That's a Bitcoin improvement proposal.
And that plan needed.
It needed a really high level of support from Bitcoin miners. Like 95% of miners had to signal they were ready for it within a specific time window.
95%. That sounds almost impossible to get.
It proved to be incredibly difficult, yeah. There was significant resistance from miners.
Why? What were the miners worried about with SegWit?
Well, there were probably a few things going on. One might have been economic. SegWit could potentially lead to lower fees per transaction because there's more space. So some miners might have worried it would cut into their overall fee revenue.
Okay, a financial concern.
Possibly. And also, remember the big blockers. A chunk of the mining community genuinely preferred just increasing the block size directly. They saw that as the simpler, better way to scale, not this more complex SegWit approach. So a mix of economics and genuine technical disagreement.
So miners are dragging their feet on the 95% threshold. And this is where the users started getting involved, right? The user-activated soft fork, UASF.
Exactly. The UASF, specifically BIP 148, was this amazing grassroots movement. It was driven by Bitcoin users, node operators, people who were just fed up with the deadlock.
And their plan was?
Pretty radical, actually. They said, okay, if the miners won't activate SegWit, we will. They proposed that starting on a specific date, nodes running the UASF software would simply start rejecting any Bitcoin blocks that didn't signal support for SegWit.
Oh, so the users basically trying to force the miner's hand?
That was the idea. Put economic pressure on the miners. If their blocks started getting rejected by a growing part of the network, they'd have an incentive to signal for SegWit.
But that sounds incredibly risky. What if it went wrong?
Huge risk. The biggest danger was a chain split. If enough users adopted the UASF, but a large portion of miners didn't comply, you could end up with two separate, incompatible Bitcoin blockchains.
Which would be chaos, right? Confusion, potentially lost money.
Total chaos. It could have seriously damaged Bitcoin's value and reputation. It was in a high-stakes game of chicken.
Okay, so you've got this potential user revolt threatening to split the chain, miners hesitant. Feels like things were really coming to a head. And then another proposal enters the ring. BIP 91.
Right. BIP 91. This was proposed by James Hilliard, and it was a really clever attempt to break the stalemate. It was designed as a sort of compromise, a miner-activated soft fork.
Miner-activated, so different from the user-activated one.
Yes. It cleverly lowered the activation threshold for SegWit signaling down from that tough 95% to just 80%.
Okay, 80% is still high, but easier than 95%.
Definitely more achievable. And it used a shorter time window and a different signal bit 4 in the block header for miners to show support for BIP 91 itself first.
Okay, so miners signal for BIP 91 first.
Yeah.
How did that then lead to SegWit getting activated? What was the mechanism?
It was quite ingenious, really. Once 80% of miners signaled support for BIP 91 within its window, it locked in. And then the crucial part, nodes running the BIP 91 software would start rejecting any new blocks that didn't signal for SegWit using the original bit 1 signal.
Ah, I see. So once BIP 91 was locked in, miners basically had to start signaling for SegWit. Otherwise, their blocks would become invalid to a large part of the network.
Exactly. It created a strong economic incentive for them to fall in line and signal for SegWit, avoiding the need for the potentially dangerous UASF split while still achieving SegWit activation.
That's smart. A way to get it done without blowing things up.
Pretty much. And BIP91 got a big boost from something called the New York Agreement, or NYA.
The New York Agreement, what was that?
It was basically a public pledge. A coalition of influential mining pools and major Bitcoin companies got together and said, okay, we support this plan. Their stated goal was unity.
And what was the plan exactly, according to the NYA?
It was a two-step process. Step 1, activate SegWit using BIP91. Get that done. Step 2, around 3 months later, implement a hard fork to increase the base block size to 2 MB.
Ah, so it was trying to be a compromise. SegWit first, satisfying the small blockers and enabling layer 2, but then a 2 MB increase later to give something to the big blockers.
That was the idea, a potential path to peace, satisfying both sides. SegWit first, then 2x the block size. That's why it was often called SegWit 2x.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
But we know things didn't quite go that smoothly, did they? Because a hard fork did happen, but it wasn't SegWit 2x.
No, it wasn't. Before the SegWit 2x hard fork could even happen, a different group forced the issue. On August 1st, 2017, Bitcoin Cash, BCH, emerged.
Bitcoin Cash. So that was a hard fork, a permanent split.
Yes, a full hard fork from the main Bitcoin chain. And Bitcoin Cash made some key different choices. They significantly increased the block size right away initially to 8 MB, and they planned for even larger later, up to 32 MB.
Wow, 8 MB straight off the bat. That's a big jump.
It was. And crucially, Bitcoin Cash deliberately chose not to implement SegWit.
So BCH was basically the big blocker camp saying, okay, we're doing it our way. Forget SegWit. We're just going for much bigger blocks right now.
That's a fair summary. Their main goal was achieving that high on-chain transaction throughput immediately, aiming for those fast, cheap digital cash payments directly on the blockchain, even if it meant splitting off.
But how has Bitcoin Cash fared since then? Has it become that global digital cash?
Well, it's faced its challenges. There was some network instability early on. Obviously, the community split was a big factor. And frankly, it just hasn't gained the same level of adoption or network effect as Bitcoin itself.
Right. Network effect is huge in this space.
Absolutely. And interestingly, the Bitcoin Cash community itself had further splits later on. Bitcoin SV, for example, forked off from BCH, wanting even larger blocks like 128 MB initially. So even within that big block philosophy, the arguments continued.
Okay, so BCH went its own way. But what about the second part of that New York agreement? The planned 2 MB hard fork for the main Bitcoin chain SegWit 2x. What happened there?
Right, SegWit 2x. So SegWit did activate successfully, largely thanks to BIP91 paving the way. The next step was supposed to be that 2 MB hard fork about 3 months later, as agreed in the NYA.
And it had backing, right, from those big miners and companies in the NYA.
Initially, yes, it had significant industry and miner support stemming from that agreement. Looked like it might actually happen.
But it didn't. Why did SegWit 2x ultimately fail?
It fell apart, essentially due to a lack of broad community consensus. Despite the backing from some big players, there wasn't enough support from the wider community, and critically, not from many of the core Bitcoin developers.
What were the main objections?
There were serious concerns about the risks of doing another hard fork so soon, especially one that some felt was being rushed. A big sticking point was the lack of robust replay protection.
Ah, replay protection. That's the thing that stops transactions from one chain being accidentally spent on the other after a fork.
Exactly. Without it, a hard fork can be really messy and dangerous for users' funds. Plus, there was a strong feeling among many users and developers that SegWit 2x felt like a backroom deal by corporations and miners trying to impose their will on the network without genuine grassroots agreement.
Kind of went against the decentralized ethos.
That was the argument, yeah. The hashtag No2X movement gained a lot of traction online. So facing this growing resistance and the technical concerns, the proponents eventually announced they were suspending the SegWit 2x hard fork just weeks before it was scheduled. It never happened.
Wow. So this whole saga, SegWit activation, Bitcoin Cash fork, the failed SegWit 2x,
Yeah.
it really throws Bitcoin's whole governance model into the spotlight, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's fascinating because there's no CEO of Bitcoin, no board of directors making calls.
Right. So how did decisions get made?
Yeah. It relies on this messy, sometimes chaotic process, often called rough consensus. It involves all the different players, developers writing the code, miners securing the network, users running nodes and actually using Bitcoin, businesses building services. They all have a voice, in a way.
And we saw that grassroots power in action, didn't we? With the UASF movement pushing for SegWit.
Definitely. And the hashtag No2X campaign pushing against SegWit2X. It showed that user sentiment and activism, often coordinated online, can have real influence. Public signaling matters. Miners signal with bits in their blocks. Businesses make public statements like the NYA.
And ultimately, the nodes enforce the rules, right? That code is law idea.
That's the bedrock. No matter how much mining power or corporate money gets behind a proposal, if the nodes running the software don't accept the new rules, it doesn't become Bitcoin. The nodes have the final say by choosing which software to run.
And the failure of SegWit2X, even with all that initial industry backing, really proved that point, didn't it? It showed the limits of trying to coordinate changes from the top down in Bitcoin.
A huge lesson learned. It really reinforced that decentralization isn't just a buzzword. It has teeth in Bitcoin's governance. And actually, this whole period also led to improvements in how changes are proposed and discussed. The BIP process became more formalized, more focused on technical rigor and community review.
Okay, so looking back now, years later, what are the really big, lasting impacts of the scaling wars? How did it change Bitcoin long term?
Several key things stand out. First, obviously, SegWit got activated. And that wasn't just a temporary fix. It became the foundation for Layer 2 scaling.
Like the Lightning Network.
Exactly. Lightning Network, which allows for super fast, super cheap Bitcoin payments, really depends on SegWit fixing that transaction malleability problem we talked about. SegWit also paved the way for later upgrades, like Taproot, which improves privacy and efficiency.
And SegWit adoption is pretty high now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's widespread. Around 80% or more of transactions use it now, so it's definitely become standard. That's a major long-term win from that period. Well, as we discussed, it strongly reinforced Bitcoin's resistance to centralized control and really cemented decentralization as a top priority for the community, maybe even above rapid scaling on the base layer.
And the Bitcoin Cash fork.
That created a lasting ideological split, for sure. But, looking at market cap, adoption, development activity, Bitcoin Cash hasn't really kept pace with Bitcoin, which perhaps highlights the power of Bitcoin's network effect and maybe suggests users generally prefer Bitcoin's more conservative upgrade path.
And it probably solidified a preference for soft forks over hard forks going forward. Less risky.
I think that's fair to say. The community saw how contentious and risky hard forks can be. Soft forks became the preferred way to upgrade the protocol. The biggest lesson really was that you need broad, voluntary consensus for major changes. It can't just be miners, it can't just be businesses.
The users, the nodes, they have the power. The UASF showed that.
It really did. Coordinated user action is a powerful force in Bitcoin.
So where does that leave Bitcoin scaling today? What's the focus now?
The focus is heavily on building out and improving those Layer 2 solutions, primarily the Lightning Network, but also things like sidechains, such as the Liquid Network, for different use cases. Plus, there are still incremental improvements happening on the base layer itself, like Taproot.
So it's a multi-layer approach now. Base layer for security and final settlement. Layer 2 for speed and volume.
That's the vision, yes. Using different layers for what they do best.
Okay, so wrapping up, the scaling wars sound like they were a genuinely defining moment for Bitcoin, a real trial by fire.
Absolutely. It tested the technology, it tested the community, it tested the governance model. It was painful, no doubt, lots of arguments and division.
But ultimately, you'd say Bitcoin came out stronger.
I think so.
Yeah.
More decentralized, perhaps, with a clearer sense of its priorities and how difficult but necessary achieving consensus is. It really forged Bitcoin's identity in many ways.
It leaves you with a big question, though, doesn't it? Thinking about everything the community learned during those wars. How should they tackle the inevitable future challenges? New scaling needs, potential upgrades. How do you keep innovating while fiercely protecting that decentralization and security? Finding that balance, well, that's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? Definitely something for you, the listener, to think about.